Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Wavelengths, an Amphenol Broadband Solutions podcast. I'm your host, Daniel Litwin, the voice of B2B, and welcome, folks, to another episode of the show as we continue to explore major trends, technologies, timely news topics, and the people behind the telecom and larger communications industries. Again, make sure you're heading to our website, amphenolbroadband.com, for previous episodes of the show and to make sure you don't miss out on future ones. You can also find other resources related to the topics we'll be breaking down today, as well as more info on our solutions and services on our website, amphenolbroadband.com. And make sure that you're subscribing to Wavelengths on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. Just hit that subscribe button and you'll get notifications when we drop new episodes. And you can also check out the back catalog of conversations. There's plenty of good ones there. All right, folks, let's dive in to the episode today. So on today's episode of Wavelengths, we're actually turning our focus away from some of our usual topics of technology, technology trends, federal funding initiatives. We spend lots of time breaking those down. And we're actually going to look at the telecom and network workforce, right? The folks that are behind the scenes making it happen for the industry. And more importantly, we're going to focus in on the importance of continuous education of our network professionals. What do I mean and why? Well, let's give a little more context. We're obviously in an era where networks in general are expanding in scope. They're becoming not only smaller, but bigger. We're seeing them deployed for more use cases and more technologies in more industries. 5G rolling out en masse, the Internet of Things, both in industrial and home and commercial settings, proliferating and expanding its reach and use cases. Remote work, more prevalent than ever, putting strain on more touch points with network reliability and network consistency between end users. And the telecom industry is obviously at the heart of this transformation. But guess what stands between seamless connectivity and catastrophic failure? Well, that would be network reliability and network resilience. So as we push the boundaries of what's possible with our networks, the stakes for maintaining a robust network has really never been higher. But here's the kicker, right? It's not just about the tech. More importantly, it's about the people behind the tech that are helping keep things afloat. And that's where today's episode comes in. Today, we're going to be detailing the importance of technical education for maintaining reliable networks and why upskilling your team is not a nice to have or a fun perk for employee retention. It's actually a must have, and we're going to explain why. We're going to discuss actionable strategies for internal onboarding, external technical training, the partnerships and curriculum development and dynamics there, and how those educational initiatives directly impact your network's resilience. And who better to share these strategies than our very own training manager here at ABS. So I'm pleased to welcome our expert for today's conversation, Mr. Charles Dillard. He's training manager for Amphenol Broadband Solutions. Charles, great to have you on, man. How you doing today?
I'm doing great, Daniel. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thank you again for joining us and shedding some light on what is your expertise, your career, right, is helping guide the professionals that make the telecom industry possible and make sure that they're fully up to date on changing technologies and dynamics in the industry. And we're going to break all those down. So again, thanks for sharing your perspectives and knowledge pool with our audience. I want to go ahead and just jump right in. I gave a few examples, but I want to paint the big picture, right? So even if this seems a bit elementary, can you share in your view why network reliability has become more in focus, right? Such a mission critical element for businesses and industries of all walks. Give us your high level thoughts there.
First, you have to identify what a reliable network looks like. So now when we talk about hardware and software and how it's evolved, probably the biggest change is less about a particular software or hardware, but interfacing, manufacturer interfacing with each other because there are more people interfacing, with that piece of equipment or that technology or that device. So whether it's a television manufacturer that has apps on their TVs now, and then now you have a cable operator that needs to be able to stream content. And you have to have the test equipment that can actually, monitor and test for impairments, etc. So as we think about hardware and software, the biggest changes is that more people are coming together and having conversations about, the roadmap, the end goal. And, again, that's the probably the biggest evolution.
I'm curious how all of these different things are coming together to impact the workforce that maintains and upgrades these systems, right? Have improvements to network tech, expansions of network reach, new networks. Has this all created any strain for the network professionals that help maintain said networks? What's been some of the domino effects over the last few years?
Great question. When you look at the workforce, you have your two segment, like new employees, and then you have your existing employees that may have been around, for years, decades, even. And with any time there's new technology, there's a learning curve. And what we're seeing is that with new people that are coming on, they were born, with mobile devices in their hand, understanding Wi-Fi and what a SSID is. Whereas we may have some more tenured employees who, came up from the old school way of, everything was just RF, analog, and over the years they have had to get out of their comfort zone. And anytime with hardware and software updates, especially software, it changes so fast. If you think about, your mobile phone, no matter who your provider is, there seems to always be an update that they want you to download because they're continually trying to improve their networks and they're noticing, some bugs in the system, et cetera. So, again, it's important to stay on top of, understanding these technologies. But in the workforce, again, making sure that everyone, understands whatever, industry you're in, the services that you're providing, how it works, and how you're able to troubleshoot it, if there is a problem with it.
I want to intersect another interesting transformation that we're seeing, not just in network technology, really in a lot of OT and IT fields. We see this in like HVAC as well, for example, completely different, but just to paint that larger picture, network tech, hardware and software nowadays are coming equipped with a lot of intelligence, right? We're talking edge intelligence, better data insights, automated and proactive oversight baked in to the hardware or the software in a way that it hadn't been 10, even 5 years ago. Is this level of intelligence, of sort of added features for better insights and even automation, is this helping network professionals provide regular maintenance of tech and systems to an enhanced degree? Or has it also come with its own operational challenges, getting the workforce to understand some of these new systems and the insights that they provide? I'm sure it's a little of both, but walk me through that dynamic and what you're seeing, if either of those options.
Yeah, I think it's helped quite a bit. There's nothing more important than having information at the hand of the person that needs it in real time. So to have the ability to have test equipment that can show you the entire network. For example, I remember, back in my cable days of being a field technician, I would go to a customer house, I would have my signal level meter and I had the ability to check the signal and then I had to troubleshoot from there. But like you mentioned, now those same test equipment has a lot more features, a lot remote monitoring and telemetry possibilities. And so what happened is now a technician can look at an entire network. So for example, not just that one customer that may be plugged to that service tab, but they can remote into software and look at everybody that's feeding out of that optical node. And then instantly they can see, is this a neighborhood issue or is this just going to be a single customer issue? And based on that, they're able to make a decision faster. Is it something that I can just fix myself at the subscriber's home, or do I need to contact, a maintenance technician because there appears to be, a problem in the network? But, there's technicians and supervisors and managers, they want to be able to look at the network in the area that they're responsible for to make sound decision of, sending the right person for that job, and not having to send some person and then having to send a maintenance tech or a construction tech later. So and that is only because of these edge equipment and devices having more intelligence with it. But there's some challenges with that, which is the training side of it. Getting people to understand, like with this meter, you have all these options, and knowing which option to use for the particular impairment. So that is addressed with training. But over time, as they run into those issues, day after day, just like anything, it becomes second nature to them.
So let's get a little more into the training layer of this conversation, right? Obviously, a major part of making sure networks are well maintained and keep up with some of these, market shifts, industry shifts, continuous evolutions to technology, is to have well-trained employees, right? The linchpin of network reliability is obviously the pros that help keep those networks reliable. So I'm curious, being a technical and training manager yourself, what are your thoughts on the importance of technical education, and how critical is this for network reliability, both for improving skills around troubleshooting and keeping networks up, both for new entrants to the workforce, but also for vets, right? Folks that have been in the workforce for a while. Give us your thoughts on the importance of this layer for overall network health and reliability.
I may be a little biased just because I've been in training for 2 decades now in the cable industry, but it's extremely important. And there are, in the past, a lot of companies, they view training as a nice to have. It wasn't perceived as a revenue generating department. So in the past, training was kind of put on the back burner. But the message over the years that we put out is that although it may not be revenue generating, if you don't have a properly trained workforce, it could cost you a lot of money and repeats and poor services for our customers, to the point of where customers may leave our services and go to another provider.
And being that you've been in the industry for 20 years, or 20 years plus, I want to get some anecdotal stories here to help frame this in practice, right? The benefit and utility of continued education and fresh education for new entrants in the field as well. So can you paint some examples, pulling from your extensive experience and, maybe literal training moments from your career that really showcase what you've seen in terms of the value and benefit of technically trained, continuously trained network pros, being able to better troubleshoot and make informed decisions in today's network tech ecosystem? What are your thoughts there?
I remember when a company that I worked for, we first launched internet service. And I had my first training was to get technician to understand how to set up a cable modem and log into a computer and troubleshoot. What I learned over the years was that, physical stuff, it's easier for people to learn how to do because they can look and see, hey, there's not a light on that device. It must be unplugged, et cetera. The cable's not plugged in. But with internet, we were introduced to more logical troubleshooting. And so we had to teach technician, what is an IP address, and how does having the wrong IP address or subnet mask can cause a lack of connection, on a network, right? So because they couldn't put their hands on it, it was a lot harder for them to, understand the logical side of, how data works. So, but as we did a lot more of that training, what I noticed over the years is that as we started to introduce other technologies, whether it was a voice over IP, now we get into DOCSIS 4.0. We're currently doing DOCSIS 3.1, and a lot of that stuff, even like with Remote PHY, where we're taking what used to be information that was stored in the head end, And now we're pushing some of those layers, layer 1 and layer 2 of the OSI model out into the field. But it's more logical than anything.
And that's cool to hear, right? That there's somewhat of a domino effect, right? Once you build that habit, that mentality, and that strategy really for continuous education, each sort of further continued node of education gets a little simpler. It adds on to an already existing pool of knowledge. But I'm curious, though, I imagine sometimes there's a major shift in the market, in workflows and technologies and available, tools to help sort of assess the health of a network. I'm curious if that poses any key challenges in keeping a curriculum up with some of these evolutions. And could you break down for us some of your strategies for curriculum development and how you make sure to match said curriculum to where the market's at and where you see it heading?
Is that how do we have our curriculum have a longer shelf life, but then also pointing learners to where that document is housed. Another thing with that also is that when we point learners to where information is, it puts learning in their own hands. So instead of a instructor in front of a classroom telling them, this is the answer and here's why, we're pulling learning out of the individual in that case. And when you do that, what we've noticed over the years is that they get used to trying to go and find information, whether it's on a training site or a process engineering site. So that way they're not dependent on the next time they're in a training class, and which will, eventually, build a culture of continuous, education and the desire to keep learning.
And I want to hone in now on those learning strategies, right? Because it's one thing to acknowledge that training is key and to implement it, but it's another to really bake it into the culture of an organization, a company, a trade org, even a partnered trade school or something that helps facilitate some of this training. And that hits on some of the distinct challenges and strategies for internal onboarding and internal continuous training versus external technical training. Can you discuss some of the benefits of both of those pools, right? Is one more effective than another? Do they need to complement each other? Kind of what does that ecosystem look like in today's larger sort of telecom industry?
Yeah, great question. Internal training, there are some things that you want your workforce to know and understand where there is no deviation of that information, meaning, for example, compliance related training. It is that company's policy that, you conduct yourself in a certain manner. Same thing with, your internal specification, we want to make sure that a particular device in the network has the appropriate signal level and voltage level. So our internal training team will make sure that the workforce understands, those metrics and that information. But then there's times where, you take external training, whether it's, for example, a vendor. You have all this equipment in your network, whether it's amplifiers or, passive devices, optical nodes, et cetera, and different flavors of it. Well, no one is going to be more of an expert than the individual that make it. So that's where partnering with, external, entities such as vendors can come into play and help you out. Whereas your internal team can focus on, new hire training, making sure they understand, HR policies and the company specs and procedures and policies. Whereas we can leverage, example, vendors to cover the new equipment that, just showed up in the warehouse. And hopefully that's not the first time they're aware of that there's the new equipment coming is when it shows up in the warehouse. but using external entities, and not even just them, but committees, that create standards, like SCTE and Cisco, leveraging them. So that way, your trainer can focus on internal, content, but then also they can have time to build their skill set, and they're not having to learn every type of possible device and how it works, et cetera. So both are necessary, and if used, the right way, can be very effective.
This is a layer of the topic that, we see in most industries that especially have a tenured workforce, that have professionals who have really, cut their teeth on the industry, made a name for themselves, planted their flag, and have some pride in their existing skills. I imagine there might be some challenges in sort of the culture of desiring more skills, right? Of kind of helping professionals understand that even if you are great at your job now, there's always something fresh to add to the pool so you can stay competitive in the market. Do you see any of those kinds of challenges, right? Challenges around setting a culture of education, of continued education, setting a culture of pros desiring and understanding the importance of expanding their knowledge pools. And if you do see some of that, what are some strategies that you see and try yourself for fostering that culture of continuous learning in the industry?
Yeah, especially like you mentioned with whether it's technicians or whoever the employees are that's been there forever. A lot of time it comes down to how do you position them more as a mentor role versus just another technician, and for an example. And part of that is like you mentioned, what the culture is that you know as leaders in the company, I think we have to do a better job of letting everyone in the company to see and understand the roadmap that senior leadership and engineering, et cetera, has kind of defined for the company. So what will your company look like, say, a year from now or 3 years from now? And don't wait until we're getting ready to launch a new architecture or initiative, say like fiber to the home. We want to start kind of planting the seed that, hey, here's where our company is now, here's where we're going. And when you do that, people that's been in the industry a long time, we have the ability to meet people where they are. Nowadays people are on their mobile devices. So we don't want to only design training for the classroom. We want to make sure that, if they're always on their mobile phone, then that's where, we as a company, that's where we as a training organization, because we're competing with people's attention. And if their attention is on their mobile device, we need to be there. If they're watching videos, we need to be in that format. And if we can do those things, then, those, veteran employees that's been there a long time, they're more apt to, to join in and embrace, continuing their education. So.
All right, Charles, we're just about done with the conversation. Thank you for your perspective so far today, sharing all of your on-the-ground experiences and, your strategies for successfully implementing continued technical education for network pros. I'm curious now, as we wrap up, looking ahead, where you see this landscape continuing to evolve, whether that's the larger telecom market or the technologies around it, or even just more specifically, the future of technical education within that evolving landscape. What do you see as the future based on how the industry is continuing to evolve? And any final thoughts here for our audience?
There's a lot of smart people all over the world. And, they're one thing about trainers, they love to share information. So it's not hard to get information out of them, but how do we scale training? And also, and one way of doing that is not, keep it in a box and think that it has to be a real person in real time. It could be videos, it could be animation, it could be virtual reality. So if you build it, they will come. And I am an advocate of like new things, thinking outside of the box, and learning. And I want to leave with this note: is that, for those that embrace training and learning, but even the ones that are hesitant because they felt like in school I was never book smart, etc. When I first became a trainer, a mentor taught me early on. He said, the first rule of being a trainer is you'll never know everything. And as soon as you understand that, you're going to be great. So what you want to do is figure out, how do I find information? And that's what we want to do for our workforce, is have information that they can access at any time and know where to find it. And then when we need to, gather them for, hands-on training and instructor-led training, we can, make time for that. So.
All right. Well, I think on that note, Charles, we'll go ahead and wrap up the conversation. So, Charles, thank you so much for your time today on the show. Again, for digging into what you've seen as the benefits of continued and new technical education for network professionals, and some strategies for implementing those thoughtfully, whether internally or partnering with external entities to help make it happen. Again, folks, we've been chatting with Charles Dillard, Training Manager for Amphenol Broadband Solutions. Charles, if folks want to find out a little bit more about how ABS is supporting this ecosystem of training, maybe learn from you, maybe get in touch, where should we point them?
Yes, thanks, Daniel. They can go to our site, AmphenolBroadbandSolutions.com. We're on YouTube, LinkedIn. We're putting out a lot of content, a lot of fiber-related content, videos, etc. Or they can reach me at cdillard@abs-go.com.
Fantastic. Easy enough. All right, Charles, thank you again for your time. I really appreciate you, again, joining us and sharing your perspectives with our audience. I'm sure they found it useful and strategic. So much appreciated. We'll obviously be chatting again soon. Thank you again.
Thanks, Daniel.
And thank you, everyone, for tuning into this episode of Wavelengths, an Amphenol Broadband Solutions podcast. If you like what you heard and saw today and you want to tap into previous perspectives, or you want to make sure you don't miss out on future conversations on the show, make sure that you're heading to our website, amphenolbroadband.com. Again, amphenolbroadband.com, and subscribe to the show on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. I'm your host, Daniel Litwin, the voice of B2B. We'll catch you on the next episode of Wavelengths.